Today's podcast is about a little-known case of a missing cab driver. He finished his shift that day with everything going smoothly. However, after that, the mystery began. Almost 43 years later, his family and friends are still trying to figure out what happened that day. Let's talk about Clayton Mark Bussiere. First, for clarification for our story, at the time, Mosquee and Abbotsford were two separate municipalities located only 5 miles apart in British Columbia, Canada. They were merged together in 1995 and are now both referred to as the City of Abbotsford. Since the merge happened 13 years after this mystery, I will be referring to them as two separate locations. Clayton Mark Bussiere lived at home with his parents in Mosquee, British Columbia. He was working to save up money to get a place of his own. He was described as a hard worker, nice, and very quiet. Clayton also worked as a cabbie and occasionally a dispatcher for Abbotsford Taxi in nearby Abbotsford, British Columbia. Clayton covered all different shifts and owned his cab, which was a 4-door Robin's Egg Blue 1978 Pontiac Grand Le Mans. He had purchased the car just 1 month prior, and since he did own it, he drove it for his personal use as well. On Sunday, October 17, 1982, 25-year-old Clayton Bussiere had spent a few hours playing poker during a slow afternoon with his friends at the cab depot. Fellow dispatcher and cab driver Ron Johnson said that Clayton seemed fine. He was down a few dollars, but was laughing and joking like normal. Clayton then left that night between 5 and 5:30 p.m. The next day promised to be a special day for Clayton. It was his 26th birthday. In most accounts, it is stated that Clayton was thought to be headed home for a small birthday celebration. However, in an interview with the Abbotsford News, his mother said that she didn't expect to see her son until the next night, October 18th, his birthday, when the family would then have a birthday celebration for him. Clayton did live with his parents, but his mother said that her son would often spend the night at his friend Wayne Golden's house in Langley, British Columbia. Clayton's friend Wayne Golden would corroborate that. He had definitely expected to see his friend that night for dinner and a couple of drinks. He also said that he had even planned on going with Clayton the next night to his home for a birthday dinner. However, Clayton would never show up at his friend's house after work on October 17th. A few hours later, another cabbie, who was a co-worker of Clayton's, was having dinner at the Highlight Burger Bar in Mission when he noticed Clayton drive by. This would have been about 14 miles from the cab depot and about 90 minutes after he ended his shift. It did not appear as if he were alone, however, as the co-worker said that he had a passenger in the front seat. Shortly after that, around 7 p.m., he saw Clayton drive by again, this time towards downtown, and it didn't look like he had a passenger this time. Clayton was supposed to work another shift the next morning and was due to be at Abbotsford Taxi at 7 a.m. However, he didn't show up for work, which was highly unusual for him. His family nor his friends had seen him that morning. It appeared that Clayton Bussiere was now missing. His disappearance was reported to the Abbotsford police. They began a search where they followed up a few leads and checked a few remote areas, but found no trace of Clayton or his taxi. The entire area around there is pretty remote. The family even hired a medium who came to their house and told them that he was in the water. Clayton's mother, Eileen, told the Vancouver Sun, "We just feel that a sickie has been out doing things. That's what I feel, but I could be wrong." She went on to say that her son was very conscientious and he would always call if he was going to miss supper or even be a little late. Yet no one would hear from Clayton. Family and friends would also assist in the search. They put up 1,500 flyers around British Columbia. They also searched isolated roads, abandoned buildings, and wooded areas. Fellow cabbies would be on the lookout for his car, and they would even call out his name on their radios, hoping for a response. His best friend Scott Pedd, along with some other friends, would post a $1,500 reward for information on where Clayton was. Everyone was baffled at what could have happened to him. On October 20th, 200 yards from the Dewdney Bridge, which is less than 10 miles from Mission and Motsqui, a fisherman found a shoe with a sock in it. It was initially found just 3 days after Clayton disappeared. Unfortunately, the fisherman tossed it back in the water. By his description, the shoe was similar to one that Clayton was thought to be wearing when he disappeared. It would be 9 days later before police divers would search the area, but unfortunately, they were unable to locate the discarded shoe. When trying to find out more information on Clayton, I came across an interesting article from the summer of 1983 in the Vancouver Sun. Motsqui was a very small town, but another man would go missing from there just 7 months after Clayton. In fact, the two men lived very near each other. Robert Carl Litschauer, referred to as Bob, lived at 34487 Pearl Avenue in Motsqui. Clayton Bussiere lived at 34422 Pearl Avenue, so the two men only lived a block apart. Bob Litschauer was 26, lived alone, and owned a store called Relco Electronics. On May 11, 1983, Litschauer enjoyed time with friends at a local cabaret and then left that night in his 1981 Honda Prelude. He too would never return home. Since he lived alone and worked for himself, it wasn't even discovered that Bob Litschauer was missing until almost 2 weeks later. His parents, who lived in Montreal, about 2,800 miles away, became concerned when their son didn't answer his phone. They alerted local authorities and an investigation was started. Litschauer's parents and authorities weren't sure whether there could be a connection between the two men's disappearances. Although they lived very near each other in a small town, it wasn't thought that they knew each other, and they did disappear 7 months apart. Bob Litschauer's parents described their son as quiet and a bit of a loner, but that he had good friends and no known enemies. His mother had spoken to him the day before he went missing, and he seemed to be in good spirits. The family and law enforcement would search Cultus Lake and the Sumas Mountain. The search was said to be hindered, though, by thick foliage. His mother, Hilda Litschauer, didn't think that he would just disappear on purpose. She said that he did like long drives, and she thought that he could be off-road somewhere in distress. Sadly, his mother's instinct would be partly correct. On December 31st, 1983, 7.5 months after he disappeared, 2 raccoon trappers came across a 1981 Honda Prelude in heavy underbrush at the foot of an embankment about 100 feet from Hazelwood Road. That area was only a few miles from Pearl River, where Litschauer lived. The decomposed body found under the car was soon identified as Bob Litschauer. No foul play was suspected, and the autopsy findings indicate that his death appeared to occur due to injuries sustained in an automobile accident. It was definitely a tragic death, but it was an accident. With now one mysterious disappearance being solved, the other one remained. Clayton Bussiere was still missing. Family and friends knew the possibility was there that Clayton could have ended up, like Bob Litschauer, in a well-hidden place in his cab due to a traffic accident. Clayton and his car could also be in the water. There was a body of water nearby that I want to talk about, and that is the Fraser River. It is a beast and the longest river in British Columbia. It has a length of 854 miles with an average depth of 40 to 60 feet. However, there is one area of the river referred to as Hell's Gate that is said to be 110 feet wide and ranges a whopping 90 to 210 feet deep. The Fraser also has a strong current. In fact, the water that flows through the Hell's Gate area is said to be more than twice the water flow of Niagara Falls. Abbotsford is the town where Clayton left after work that night. Mission is the town where Clayton was last spotted. There is a point in the trip from Abbotsford to Mission where you have to cross the Fraser River via the Mission Bridge. Could that be where the area where the missing cabbie is? As is usual in many missing person cases, there were plenty of supposed sightings of Clayton after he disappeared. They ranged from him being seen in Las Vegas and Reno to being spotted on Main Street drunk out of his mind. There were about 80 sightings reported throughout British Columbia, but since all the sightings seemed to happen at the same time, they were dismissed as unfounded. Police also checked the computerized license records kept at the U.S.-Canada border at Sumas, but came up with nothing. I'm sure that the police want to keep some things to themselves, and perhaps that is why there isn't much information about this next sighting. However, it was reported in a newspaper article from 1988 that Clayton was last spotted that night at the First Avenue bowling alley in Mission with an unknown person. Remember, Mission is the small town where the diner was, where Clayton's co-workers say they saw Clayton pass by in his taxi with a passenger inside. So perhaps Clayton's last fare was to the bowling alley in Mission. I do want to add that even though the co-worker is certain that he saw a passenger in the cab the first time Clayton passed by, it appears that he didn't think that he saw a passenger inside on the second sighting, but he could not be 100% positive, which just makes the actions of Clayton Bussiere that night even more mysterious. Was he alone that night when he was driving back into Abbotsford, or was there a mystery passenger with him? Sadly, many years would go by with no new information or any trace of Clayton Bussiere, but several years later his name would be back in the news briefly. In the year 2000, 18 years after Clayton's disappearance, a tow truck driver was recovering a stolen vehicle from a densely forested area of the Sumas Mountains near Upper Sumas Mountain Road, which is not far from the Fraser River. The tow truck driver claimed that he saw a taxi at the bottom of a steep embankment. He mentioned it to the police officer on the scene in 2000, but the tow driver and the officer were apparently both unaware of the Bussiere case at the time. In 2002, Clayton's missing persons case had come to the officer's attention, and he then remembered the tow truck driver sighting from 2000. So in June of that year, search and rescue were sent to scour the area. The dense foliage hampered their vision of seeing anything at that time of year. After the leaves had fallen, they did another sweep of the area in mid-November of 2002. Unfortunately, they did not find a taxi, but they did find something: the remains of a male at the bottom of a steep cliff. It wasn't thought at the time to have been Clayton. I couldn't find information about who it was, if they were ever able to tell, and Clayton is still reported as missing, so obviously it was not him. There's an episode on the True North True Crime podcast from late 2022 where they talk about this disappearance. Clayton's family is not interviewed on the podcast, but the host did speak to them during their research, and it was interesting because sometimes you can only glean so much from old newspaper articles. The family thinks that Clayton met with foul play that night. They also revealed something that isn't mentioned anywhere online or in any old articles about this case that I want to talk about. According to his family, Clayton had a girlfriend. That in itself would not be strange, but they said they had been together for about 2 years and he had spoken about her to his mother. However, his parents had never even met her, and remember that Clayton lived with his parents at the time of his disappearance. No one seems to know anything about her. I don't know if the family even knows her name. There was another thing that the family revealed concerning Clayton's girlfriend that was very surprising. When Clayton disappeared, his girlfriend never surfaced. She never came forward to offer support to his family. She never contacted any of his friends to get more information about his disappearance. She never contacted law enforcement to inquire or to try to be of help in their investigation. She never helped in any of the searches, even though Clayton's family and friends diligently searched for him. Why in the world would Clayton Bussiere's girlfriend of 2 years not even seem to care that he was missing? Clayton's family also mentioned something to the TCTN podcast host that caught my attention. They said that Clayton had a minor legal matter that he needed to take care of in the United States. Abbotsford is very close to the U.S. border. In fact, it is only about 5 miles from Sumas, Washington. Clayton did drive his cab into Washington for his work. He even had a Washington state license plate on his cab, as well as one from Canada. Although an interesting bit of information, the family didn't seem to know what the minor legal matter was. The question is, did it have anything to do with his disappearance? Unfortunately, there isn't much online about Clayton's disappearance, mainly just a handful of local newspaper articles from around the time that he went missing. However, Clayton's family does want to keep his name out there, which is why they agreed to talk to the TNTC podcast host. True North True Crime also talked about why they wanted to do an episode on Clayton Bussiere's disappearance. Since there is such little coverage, they wanted to create a digital footprint of his case, at least something online to keep the story out there. I thought that was such a great thought, and that's why it is so important to cover the lesser known cases. Even with just a little coverage, there is at least something about these cases online to be a source of information that may even help to solve the case someday. As far as my thoughts on this case, first I'll talk about what I don't think happened that night. I don't think Clayton Bussiere disappeared willingly that night. Outwardly, he was doing well in his life and apparently had a girlfriend and was saving up for a place of his own. His birthday was the next day, and he seemed to be in good spirits and was just having a normal work day. He had made plans that night with a friend and plans the next day with his family. His mother did say that Clayton had a lot of friends, but most of them lived in Alberta, which was 600 miles away. Of course, we can never really know what is going on in someone's mind, but as far as my opinion, I think him leaving to go end his life or leaving his friends and family to start a new life that night is the least likely scenario. I also don't think that Clayton's minor legal issue in the U.S. was a factor in his disappearance. He did drive into the U.S. as a cab driver, so the minor legal matter could have been something as minor as a traffic ticket or expired registration. I certainly don't think that it would be serious enough for him to flee or have something bad happen to him because of it. There was about 90 minutes between the time when Clayton is said to have left work and when he was spotted by his coworker driving by the diner in Mission. What could he have been doing during that time? There could be numerous things. Did he perhaps go spend some time with his girlfriend or went to speak with another friend? Seeing that he was driving a cab, did some unknown person ask him for a ride, and did Clayton agree? Now, as far as Clayton meeting with foul play, that is a definite possibility. There were some articles around that time in local newspapers of cabbies being assaulted and robbed. Nothing to the level of disappearing along with their vehicle like Clayton, but being a cabbie can definitely be a dangerous job. I also found an article in the local paper in May of 1980, 6 months before Clayton would disappear. It mentioned that in the small area of Mosque that 3 homicides had been discovered in a span of just 6 weeks. One of them was a longshoreman named Peter Silik, who had been stabbed to death and found near his vandalized car just 200 yards west of the Mission Bridge that I had mentioned earlier. Another reason that the foul play scenario could be possible is that Clayton was seen with an unknown person that night after his shift ended. I am curious if he was in the habit of picking up fares even when he wasn't on the clock. I'm sure he was asked often since he was driving around in a cab, even when he wasn't working. If he was in the habit of picking up fares during off hours, then him being spotted with the passenger that night would not necessarily be suspicious. If he was last seen at a bowling alley in Mission, that would actually go along with his coworker's sighting of him in Mission that night with the passenger and then driving back not long after, possibly alone. One of the problems in figuring out this case is that seeing a cab driver with an unknown person in his car is not out of the ordinary at all. In fact, it's normal. That makes it harder to figure out what was really going on that night. I did find it strange that there was only one mention of what appeared to be Clayton's actual plans for that night. Most articles say he was going to have a birthday dinner with his family. In an article in Abbotsford News, Clayton's mother clarified. She then said that he would often stay with his friend. His friend Wayne agreed that he expected Clayton to come over. Golden lived in Langley, which was 20 miles from Abbotsford. Could something have happened to Clayton on the drive to his friend's house in Langley? I will also add that the Fraser River does also run through Langley. Although we don't know much about Clayton's mystery girlfriend, we do need to talk about whether or not she is a factor in his disappearance. First, I thought that maybe she lived in Calgary, hundreds of miles away, where a lot of his friends were at. Or maybe their relationship, although lasting for a few years apparently, was just a casual one. Or perhaps it was a secret relationship for some reason that we don't know about. It wasn't secret enough on Clayton's end, as he told his mother, but perhaps the girlfriend didn't want people to know. Even if any of those things were true, I still can't envision any scenario where she wouldn't at least reach out privately to his family or friends to ask what happened to Clayton. Yet according to the family statement on the TNTC podcast, she never did. Knowing that, I can't help but wonder if Clayton could have decided to meet up with her that night instead of going to his friends. It was his birthday the next day. Could they have met up for a private birthday celebration where something went wrong? We don't really have enough information on this mystery girlfriend to present that as a likely scenario, but I did want to talk about all the possibilities in this disappearance. Did Clayton Bussiere have a tragic accident that night? I think that is a definite possibility. He was familiar with the area, and although the weather conditions were good that night, something could have happened to distract him. People have accidents every day where they lose control and run off the road, and sometimes the reasons why are unknown or as simple as just looking away for a second or a medical emergency. Also, we don't know where Clayton was that night after work. Could he have been driving on a rural road that he wasn't familiar with? Did he lose control of the car and accidentally go down a steep cliff that he didn't see, or into the massive Fraser River? For me, the biggest thing that points to him having a tragic accident that night is the fact that both he and his car have never been found almost 43 years later. You couldn't have had a much more distinctive car than Clayton had. It was described as robin's egg blue and had the number 6 printed all over it, along with the words Abbotsford Taxi on it. I can't help but wonder if the tow truck driver's sighting could have been Clayton's car. You wouldn't think that there are many taxis in the water in that area, and I don't believe that he would have had a reason to make that up. Also add to that the fact that the Sumas Mountain, where the alleged sighting of the taxi was, is only about 5 miles from Abbotsford, where Clayton worked and was last verified to be seen. I think it is a very compelling possibility. I do think if you find his taxi, you will find Clayton. When I first heard about this case, it reminded me of something you would see on a Twilight Zone episode. A driver seen with a mysterious passenger, the passenger vanishes, and the driver does eventually as well. Then I read where Clayton's mother made that reference as well. In a newspaper article, she stated, "It's the not knowing that's hard. I would like to know one way or the other. It's like living in the Twilight Zone. You're suspended in between somewhere, and you don't know anything." This case is as strange as it is sad. A man leaves in his cab and no trace of either is ever seen again. He was seen with a mysterious passenger after he leaves work and then is seen alone. Did he leave willingly that night or perhaps met with foul play? Could what happened that night just have been a tragic accident? In a bit of irony, Clayton was wearing a St. Christopher's medal when he disappeared. St. Christopher is considered the patron saint of travelers. Did Clayton Bussiere die that night or even a few hours later on his birthday? Clayton's family has not forgotten about him, of course, and would like the recovery of their loved one to put this sad case to rest. Perhaps one day we will get the answers to what really happened during that final fair. That concludes my podcast on Clayton Mark Bussiere. If you enjoyed it, please leave me a rating or review on your favorite podcast app. Please feel free to share my podcast with your friends or on your social media pages. You can find my podcast on Amazon Music, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and iHeartRadio under one word, Lost and Found Podcast. I also have a website where you can read all of my original articles as well as links to my most recent podcast episodes at Lost and Found Blogs. I also have a Patreon page under Lost and Found Podcast, as well as social media accounts under Lost and Found Blogs on Facebook, Instagram, and X. I can be reached via email at lostandfoundpodcast@yahoo. And remember that cold cases stay cold because their story stops getting told.